Hello, I'm John Stubbings, author of The Devil Is In It and a new book called The Guitar Detective. I wrote The Devil Is In It I finished it in 2020 and published it as a limited edition of 500 hand-bound books. Fortunately, and I was very pleased that they sold pretty quickly, thanks to some support from Fretboard Journal and Acoustic Guitar magazine, who gave me some terrific reviews. And the books, whilst quite expensive, I'll admit, did actually sell not only quickly, but mainly to America and to guitar enthusiasts in Australia, Japan, Europe, and not a few in England. After I'd finished that book, I had a lot of stories left from all the research I'd done on The Devil Is In It. And I sat looking at them and thinking, there's another book in here. And so for the last 5 years, I've been writing a companion piece to The Devil Is In It that's finally been called The Guitar Detective. It's a non-fiction novel and sits alongside The Devil Is In It, both visually and thematically. It's a story of a guitar enthusiast who surprisingly finds a guitar that he's been looking at for a number of years to be on sale, as the old shop that has been displaying it for years closes and the octogenarian owners decide to sell up. The story is that the guitar, when it first arrived in the store, had belonged to an old blues guitarist who'd worked and lived in London during the 1960s. He'd strangely disappeared, and the guitar had been left with the store, and the owner had decided that he would keep it in the hope that the guitarist would come back and reclaim it one day. There was a sort of feeling that this was just one of those many guitar stories. But in fact, as time went on, it became more and more likely that the story was true, or at least had a lot of truth in it. So this is that story. I'm going to read a couple of extracts from the book over the coming weeks. This is the second chapter. Tuesday, January the 2nd, 1990. Hill Rise, Richmond. 20 years after my own blues epiphany, and ignoring the growing pile of unpaid bills and invoices still waiting on my desk from before the Christmas holiday, I was returning to Richmond, but this time on a mission. I parked my car, an Austin Mini, in Hill Rise, directly outside the narrow-windowed music shop, hemmed in between a rather forlorn dress shop and an abandoned florist's. The old red Mini was the only car in the street as I waited for Potter's to reopen after the long Christmas holiday. Mr. and Mrs. Potter had run the small shop in the polite West London enclave since the early 60s. Back then, it had 2 tiny listening booths where customers could hear records before buying. On most Saturday afternoons, there might be 3 or 4 teenagers crammed into a soundproof booth, each the size of a telephone box. Spending the afternoon listening to the records over the single mono loudspeaker was as much a social event as a way of deciding whether or not to buy the record. In 1960s Britain, the BBC rarely played pop music over the radio waves. They were reserved exclusively for the national broadcaster. So if you'd heard that a pop record was hot, or someone had said that it was really worth getting, you had to go to a record shop to hear it before investing what might be the whole of a week's spare cash. I was too young to be one of those first teenagers, but returning to Potter's a few weeks after hearing Crying at Daybreak, I bought my first Memphis Mini LP, Voodoo Lady Blues. The guy in the shop was right. Nothing was the same after hearing Howling Wolf. But Memphis Minnie was another revelation. After that, Potter became the source of countless vintage blues records, some equally revelatory, some broadly unlistenable. The shop became my go-to place for finding the authentic and the downright obscure. Every hour I spent there browsing records expanded my musical knowledge. You could learn an awful lot from the history of music by reading sleeve notes on the back of LPs. On the back of that Memphis Minnie record were a couple of paragraphs reprinted from the Chicago Defender, written just before the horror of total war was European and not yet America's business. Those sleeve notes encapsulated not just how the blues sounded, but what blues music felt like. It also gave me a sense of where it came from. Through the smoke and the racket of noisy Chicago bar floated Louisiana bayous, muddy swamps, the Mississippi dust and sun, cotton fields, lonesome roads, train whistles in the night, mosquitoes at dawn, and the rural free delivery that never brought the right letter. All these things cry through the strings of Memphis Minnie's electric guitar, amplified to machine proportions, a musical version of an electric welder plus a rolling mill. You could also learn a lot about the social history from sleeve notes, in particular American social history, as well as the civil rights and protest movements. It was reading the back of the LP covers that I first learned how much of American folk music was influenced by British folk, and also about the Jim Crow laws, racial segregation, and the themes of so many of the blues records that I was buying. Potter's, where I would spend so many Saturday afternoons, was also one of the few places where in the early 1960s, earnest young musos could discover, listen to, and buy imported blues music. One of those earnest listeners was a teenage Eric Clapp, a student at the nearby Kingston College of Art. He spent most of his free time listening to the records in the shop and figuring out just how Freddie King, Muddy Waters, and Otis Spann sounded like they did. The shop not only sold but also repaired guitars, but by the 1970s, when I became a regular, it was mainly a record shop that sold a few music accessories, sheet music, guitar strings, and the odd harmonica. The guitars hanging on the wall were second-hand instruments that Jerry Potter had been left with from those early years. Old steel-string parlor guitars, some with crudely painted tops, or ornate but broken pearl inlay. They hung above a small selection of cheap student guitars selling for just a few pounds. He'd mainly hung up the guitars that looked interesting or decorative. All had a coating of dust. Many had rusty strings, or no strings at all. Certainly most of them were unplayable. I'd occasionally ask about a guitar, and after spinning an unlikely story about how it was beyond rare or rumoured to have belonged to a Rolling Stone, Jerry would suggest a totally outrageous price. He either didn't want to sell it, or more likely couldn't be bothered to actually get it down from up on the wall. But over the previous 2 decades, one instrument hanging high on the wall had always intrigued me, always caught my eye. It was different from the others. It looked interesting, slightly scruffy, but all the more authentic for it. It looked like an American-made Martin, a maker still revered, but whose pre-war guitars were considered the Stradivarius of the acoustic guitar age. Vintage Martin guitars were regularly selling not just for a few £1,000s, but for tens of thousands. A few times over the years, I'd asked if I could look at the guitar, but Potter had always bluntly refused. Always the same answer. I'm not sure I believed him, thinking it was just another of Potter's evasion tactics. But everybody had heard the apocryphal story that it was hanging on the wall, waiting for its original owner to return. But now the lease of Potter's shop was coming to an end, something they'd advertised in their window over the Christmas period, I thought this just might be my chance to buy that guitar. And I now had a sort of money in my pocket that could persuade Potter to sell. Just in case someone else had had the same idea, I'd been outside the shop since 9:30, waiting for it to open. At 5 minutes past 10, the shop lights flickered. 15 minutes later, Potter was explaining why they weren't renewing their lease. The octogenarians had decided that now was the only time they could throw in the towel. We've asked our landlord if we could extend for a few years, but they wanted a minimum term of 15. Well, we'll have popped our clogs long before that. So this really is the end. When we turn the lights out at the end of the month, that's it. I asked Potter my usual question about buying the guitar up on the wall, still anticipating the usual answer. Over the years, I'd encountered numerous dealers or store owners with guitars, that these guitars were their pension pot. They knew they only had this chance to sell it, and I thought this was my chance to buy it. So he thought about it, and after mulling the idea over for another 30 seconds, he went and located his stepladder. I offered to give him a hand. I'm not dead yet, and I'm not really scared of heights. Over the years I'd been visiting the store, Jerry Potter had always been a sprightly man, darting between the racks to find a record, weaving between customers, flicking through the discs, or hopping up onto the counter to try and get a record down from a display shelf. But by 1990, he'd slowed down. Age had crept up on him. He was now almost completely bald and a man with a pronounced pot belly and an arthritic knee. I discreetly steadied the steps as he wheezed his way up into the gloom, unsure whether the creaking noises were his knee or the ancient rungs of the stepladder. Finally, balanced at the very top of the steps, he grunted quietly, cursing. Cobwebs and large globules of dust floated down from on high as he stretched up, slowly unhooked the guitar from its place on the wall, and rested for a long minute. Once safely back on the ground, he wiped away the worst of the guitar's dust with his handkerchief. What he brought down definitely looked like a Martin, but one that was perhaps its rarest type of guitar, an auditorium model. Jerry Potter handed me the guitar and sat down to get his breath back. I turned the instrument over and looked at the dark chocolate brown wood on the back and sides. It wasn't the mahogany that I'd been expecting. It was what top guitar makers knew as Dahlgårdia nigrilis, perfectly straight-grained Brazilian rosewood, prized for its strength and beauty, and sought after by guitar makers to use on the backs and sides of their best guitars, in particular, the very best Martin guitars. Having now fully recovered from the climb, Jerry started his explanation. I bought this guitar in the mid-60s from the night manager of Quinn's Hotel in Church Road, just round the corner. A lot of touring musicians used to stay there back in the day. A flop house, really, but it was cheap, and it was near to both the railway station and the local music clubs. The night manager of the hotel was, in Jerry's words, an unsavoury piece of work. A heavy drinker and general ne'er-do-well, he was involved in the drug scene that thrived in and around the Richmond coffee bars. While he was long departed, the Quinn Hotel was still there, but 25 years shabbier, and still the kind of place that the odd travelling musician used. I asked Jerry to explain exactly how he'd acquired the instrument now, sitting back on his lap, and prepared myself for a convoluted tale that involved at least one Beatle and a girl who'd broken Eric Clapton's heart. It was left by a black musician, an American, who was around here quite a lot back in the 60s. American guitarists and singer-songwriters regularly came to Richmond. People like Paul Simon came into my shop to buy a string and a capo, and I sold Rambling Jack Elliott a mouth harp once. Before then, country blues guitarists like Bill Brunzi and Reverend Gary Davis, even Muddy Waters from the electric scene came here to play at the Eel Pie Island and the Crawdaddy Club. Jerry's story went on that the American had left the guitar with the hotel manager for safekeeping, while he went to see a married girlfriend who lived in the north of England. But he never returned. He just disappeared. After a few months and no word, the hotel manager guessed the guy had skipped town, owing him at least 3 weeks' rent. He'd even heard a rumour that the American had been caught il fragante in the arms of a worker's wife. But the worker had killed him and buried him in the foundations of the house that he was building. A lot of players who came here worked in the Northern folk circuit, as well as in London. But the guitar might have been swapped for drugs, for all I know. Maybe he was broke and borrowed some money on it. Jerry must have also thought that the manager wanted to get rid of guitar to make some money on it. So maybe it was all a made-up story. However, Jerry had told him, if the American returns up, you can send him back to me and I'll sell the guitar to him. I was also suspicious that this story was another version of the various blues legends that I'd heard so many times before when I was looking at old guitars. A guitar pawned to buy whiskey for an alcoholic player, or a guitar sold to pay for the mother's operation. I'd come across so many of these stories before. I was also asked to believe that nearly 30 years ago, Jerry Potter bought the guitar but never had the heart to sell it, just in case the American had eventually returned. It seemed wildly generous and totally uncommercial gesture on Jerry's part. Jerry probably saw the skeptical look on my face. Working musicians are always running short of cash and often pawn guitars. I couldn't bear to think of this guy finally getting some money together and not being able to get his old guitar back. Having finally finished wiping the guitar with his handkerchief, he looked at it fondly and looked at the old instrument. It was tired looking. The fact it belonged to an unknown musician would certainly improve its value. I wondered if Jerry was reading my mind or my poker face. He looked at the guitar. I forgot how pretty this thing was. I'm surprised that Brian Jones was willing to give it to anyone, let alone a black guy. The mention of the founder and the lead guitarist of the Rolling Stones was just about the right side of subtle for Potter, and he knew he had my attention. Are you actually telling me this guitar belonged to Brian Jones? Well, it belonged to one of the Stones. That was what Giorgio Gamelski told me. I had no idea who this Giorgio character was, but one of the Stones was different to definitely being Brian Jones. If it was Charlie Watts, the band's drummer, then it was an interesting fact, but unlikely to add much value. Jagger, although a infrequent guitarist, would certainly be better Keith richer, better still. But if it belonged to the original founder of the band, Brian Jones, the one with the real passion for the blues, the visionary who wanted the group to be an authentic rhythm and blues band and not just a pop or rock and roll band, well, his guitars rarely came to auction, but when they did, they were worth an awful lot of money. If the Giorgio Gomelski story was true, which I seriously doubted. But Jerry was still telling his story. Something in my waters told me that one day he'll show up. But Brian Jones is dead. He's not showing up anywhere. He was found at the bottom of a swimming pool full of alcohol, drugs, and probably chlorinated water sometime in 1969. What made Brian Jones special, and his guitars especially valuable, was what makes Delta Blues guitarist Robert Johnson's guitars worth a king's ransom: their scarcity and linked to intrigue and tragedy. Both Johnson and Jones were members of the so-called 27 Club, a surprisingly long list of musicians who lived fast and died young. All died in their 27th year. Jones, Hendrix, and Jim Morrison, and Janis Joplin were either born within a few months of each other. And nothing makes a legend more than one who died in suspicious circumstances. And both Brian Jones and Robert Johnson died in suspicious circumstances. And in fact, both were rumoured to have been murdered. Potter stopped polishing the guitar and shook his head. I don't mean Brian Jones. I mean the black guy that left it in the hotel. I just have this strange feeling that one day this old black American guy wearing a sharp suit and carrying a silver-top cane would swagger in, ask of the guitar, sit down and play it. Silly, really. But it's why I've kept it for so long and why it's been hiding in the ceiling all this time. But I should probably let it go. All the hotel manager knew was that the musician's name was George. He never gave a surname. But from the description, Potter had decided that it was someone called George Murdo. He was in his mid-50s, I reckon, but still a good-looking guy. A bit of a cross between Big Bill Broonzy and Josh White, more polished than Broonzy and not quite as slick as White. Was he a good player? I was testing the story, curious to see what Jerry might conjure up. I never actually heard him, but I knew people who did. He was a big guy, someone who dwarfed the guitar. I saw him a couple of times in L'Auberge, the coffee shop just down from here. It's where all the art school crowds used to hang out, certainly in the 60s. They also went there to score drugs. Perhaps I wasn't surprised that there was a drug scene in the small town. I asked Jerry what was the drug of choice back then. He would have been in his 40s probably, maybe not completely out of touch with the youth culture of the 60s. Mainly bennies, amphetamines. That's what they were all on back there. Bennies and grass, and a little bit of acid. I wonder what else he knew about George Murdo. Had he actually met him? Just the once. I got him to cast his mind back 30 years. He was wearing a smart suit and chatting up some of the white girls. You know how those guys were. He was a bit like Jimi Hendrix, not just mixed race, but also in the way he handled himself, certainly the way he handled himself with women. And he was quite cultured for a black guy. A lot of them wouldn't say much more than a word or two, but Murdo was good, certainly with the old chat. He must have picked up quite a lot of it from working on the road, mixing with white guys. I remember him, he was a bit like Harry Belafonte, the guy who could speak the way he introduced himself, the way he had with girls. Like Belafonte, he was full of himself. Guess he thought he was the real deal. Was he talking about musicians in general, or black musicians in particular? Hendrix, apart from being a uniquely talented guitarist, was also had a reputation for taking LSD and attracting girls, both in copious quantities. All perks of the job, I guess. Attracting the attention of females was often the same with anyone who played the guitar. Something I hadn't realized when I first started playing guitar. Although I remember my friends telling me that if I'd actually stumbled into a brothel, I'd probably end up buying the madam a dinner and going home still a virgin. Jerry held the cleaned out guitar from in front of him again, as though to give it one last look. But from his eyes, I knew he meant to sell it. I saw the smile on his face and realized that I'd probably rumbled him. So, do you want to make me an offer? Maybe Jerry thought I was naive, or maybe just a wealthy fool. I've got no idea. You're going to have to give me a number. It looked like a Martin. If it was, and really had belonged to Brian Jones, then it was worth considerably more than the amount of cash I had on me. Potter hadn't mentioned the Martin name. Maybe he didn't realize it. He ran a record shop, so he wasn't a guitar expert, but he was no fool either. I wondered who was trying to dupe who. So I tried to stop him from being too unrealistic. Well, it's a good guitar, but it's also very worn. Unless you have the paperwork that proves it belonged to Brian Jones, then that's just a rumor. He chewed his cheek and then mentioned a number, but still a big number. Unlike most other guitar brands, many early Martins didn't have their name inlaid on the headstock, just some ornate pearl decoration. I peered inside. There was no maker's mark, but I wasn't sure early examples had labels, just discreet stamps on the back of the body. Maybe something special had fallen into my lap. Maybe. Jerry Potter was making a whole meal of the George Murdo story, and maybe he realized that the guitar wasn't really worth what he was asking. I put a fair price as my initial offer, half the amount that he'd initially suggested. I just hoped Potter didn't want to spend the rest of the day haggling. 10 minutes later, Jerry Potter was still holding out. He wanted well in excess of the cash I had in my pocket. I'd now laid out all I had on the counter in £20 notes. I pushed it around. Jerry retorted, I remember it comes with a set of strings. Sorry, Mr. Potter, but it really is all the money I've got, and I don't need a case or strings. He must realize that the chances of another buyer having as much cash on for a tired guitar was unlikely. If it's no deal, I really wish you the very best of luck, but that's me done. Potter didn't blink. I guess that was it. I stood up and started to fold the large pile of cash back into my wallet as I made my last pitch. I think you're making a mistake. We both know it's a good offer. Don't let sentiment get in the way of enough money to take Mrs. Potter on a very nice retirement holiday. He looked up at me and continued to stare into my eyes for another 20 seconds or so before speaking. If you promise on your honour that if George Murdo ever turns up and wants his guitar back, you'll sell it to him for what I paid for it in 1960. I assumed he wasn't serious. He just didn't want me to best him. And this was his get out. And while I waited for him to finish talking, I weighed up the chances of encountering George Murdo, a black American blues artist who had so far waited 30 years without seeking out the guitar that he'd left in London. I realised he must have been at least 80 years old. And as for the Rolling Stones story, well, that was just fanciful. If you promise me that, then it's yours. And with that, we shook hands.